In 2024, three developments took place that seemed unrelated at first glance. China-Africa trade climbed to nearly $295 billion. The United States completed the withdrawal of its last drone bases in Niger, leaving a silence where engines once roared. At the same time, African-American purchasing power in the United States reached more than $1.6 trillion. When you place these facts side by side, a larger story begins to appear. It is a story about who will shape Africa's future and whose security will be tested when new powers rise. Picture a family in Ouagadougou. The father spends long days at a textile stall in the market. His teenage son, Samuel, struggles with schoolwork because power cuts regularly plunge their neighborhood into darkness. This year, something changed. A modest solar installation, financed partly by remittances from an uncle in Atlanta, provided steady electricity to their home. For the first time, Samuel could log in at night and attend an online training course in computer networking. His instructor was an African-American engineer who had joined a Diaspora program linking U.S. professionals with African students. Now imagine the empty airfield at Agadez after American forces departed in August 2024. For years, drones had taken off from that base to monitor threats across the Sahel. With their departure, a new question emerged. Who would fill the vacuum? Not with soldiers, but with secure infrastructure, reliable jobs, and dependable networks. China has offered loans and concrete. Families like Samuel's are discovering another option. African resources combined with diaspora expertise can provide an alternative. This is where the tension begins. Reports describe how 3 weeks ago, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso received a call from Beijing just after midnight. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. The Chinese official on the line spoke fluent English, yet his words carried unease. Their concern was not about terrorism or political reforms. It was about partnerships that connect families in West Africa with skilled professionals abroad, transforming remittances into training and turning contracts into independence. So the question stands: if a single phone call from Beijing was filled with fear, what exactly happened in West Africa that unsettled 20 years of Chinese dominance? For 2 decades, Chinese firms believed they had mastered the art of winning contracts across Africa. They arrived with engineers, lobbyists, and bankers. They offered loans wrapped in generous promises of modern networks, faster connectivity, and new jobs for a continent eager to close the digital divide. In West Africa, a large telecommunications project was meant to be the centerpiece of that strategy. Beijing's planners were confident. They had invested 3 years in feasibility studies and political connections. By late 2023, the contract appeared certain to fall into their hands. Then an unexpected player entered the scene. An African-American software engineer named Marcus Johnson had been working quietly with technology companies in Nigeria, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. Instead of importing entire systems from abroad, Johnson and his team proposed something different. They offered to help African companies design their own networks with training, knowledge transfer, and long-term independence. Their idea was simple. Africa did not need more dependency. Africa needed expertise and innovation that matched local conditions. When the decision was announced, the surprise was immediate. The contract did not go to the Chinese state-owned enterprise. It went to a coalition of African firms supported by African-American engineers. For the first time in memory, Beijing lost a major contract in Africa, not to a Western power, but to Africans who had reached across the Atlantic to their own diaspora family. To understand why this was disruptive, look at the numbers. The United States has launched the Digital Transformation with Africa initiative, which is mobilizing about $800 million to support secure networks, digital skills, and modern institutions. The target is clear. By 2030, broadband should reach 80% of African households. These statistics reveal an important truth. Diaspora engineers teach in ways that resonate with local communities. They stay longer after class. They share personal stories of struggle and resilience. And they know how to adapt tools to villages where power outages and weak signals are part of daily life. Take the example of Ama, a young graduate in Ghana who dreamed of becoming a network security analyst. In her first job, she was limited to installing cables and replacing routers that came from foreign suppliers. Under a mentorship program supported by diaspora engineers, she learned to design security protocols for local banking applications. Today, she earns a steady income and now trains others. Her journey shows how African engineers can step out of the role of assistants and become innovators in their own right. Meanwhile, China's model had relied on a cycle of dependency. Loans required Chinese contractors, Chinese technology, and often Chinese workers. When repayments became difficult, control over assets shifted toward Beijing. For years, leaders accepted this arrangement because there seemed to be no alternative. The upset in West Africa shattered that assumption. Suddenly, governments could see a path that included expertise that was global and also personal. They could receive investment not as charity, but as support from a family network. The impact on Beijing was immediate. Officials realized they were not just competing with Western corporations. They were facing African-American professionals who combined money with credibility and cultural connection. Every contract lost to diaspora cooperation threatened the foundation of a trade empire worth nearly $300 billion. For ordinary citizens, the moment felt like a turning point. When newspapers in Accra and Lagos reported that local companies had secured the contract with diaspora backing, a sense of pride spread quickly. Students asked what else could be built if networks were now in local hands. Parents who had lived through colonial dependency recognized the deeper meaning. This was not only about faster calls or cheaper data. It was about dignity, the recognition that African knowledge and African partnerships could surpass imported solutions. For the diaspora, the telecom contract served as a signal. Many had considered African projects as side ventures. After this victory, they began to see each project as part of a larger transformation. Each dollar invested in African fiber meant less reliance on outside powers. Each hour spent mentoring a student in Accra meant knowledge that no foreign loan could replace. By the end of 2024, new bids began to appear. Diaspora-backed groups proposed data centers in Lagos, cybersecurity hubs in Accra, and satellite programs in Ouagadougou. China tried to respond with better terms, but the old narrative had collapsed. Africa was no longer locked into one path of dependency. Yet inspiration was mixed with unease. Beijing had always assumed that Africans would accept dependency as the price of development. That assumption was no longer safe. Behind closed doors, planners asked themselves a troubling question. What happens if this model spreads? What happens if more contracts slip away? And so a new chapter opened. A single telecom contract had forced Beijing to confront a challenge they never expected. The next question was simple but unsettling. If one project could shake their confidence, what would happen when diaspora partnerships expand into energy, health, and finance? 2 months after the telecom upset, Captain Ibrahim Traoré received an invitation from Beijing. The Chinese government promised first-class travel, guest house suites, and access to senior officials. On the surface, it looked like a gesture of respect. In reality, it was a strategy session to contain a threat that had unsettled 20 years of planning. The meetings in Beijing felt different from encounters with Western officials. There were no lectures on democracy and no conditions about human rights. Instead, the Chinese delegation went directly to business. They reminded Traoré that China had invested more than $200 billion in African development over the past 2 decades. They listed roads, railways, ports, and power plants as evidence of a partnership that had transformed African economies. Then they revealed their real concern. Reports had reached Beijing that Traoré was encouraging African Americans to invest directly in African infrastructure. The foreign minister said these efforts could disrupt carefully designed development strategies. Traoré asked him what he meant by inexperienced. The minister replied that African Americans might know technology and business in the United States, but did not understand African conditions or the scale of continental projects. At that moment, the truth became clear. China was not afraid of inexperience. China was afraid of competence. Beijing feared that African American professionals had the skills, networks, and resources to build alternatives to Chinese control. The next day, the agenda stretched longer than expected. Meetings with representatives of mining, construction, telecommunications, and finance companies were scheduled for 2 hours. They lasted 6. Each executive repeated the same theme in different words. African American engineers were training local workers to operate machines that were once considered exclusive to Chinese technicians. Diaspora experts were helping African firms design software that competed directly with Chinese products. Financial specialists from the diaspora were creating services that matched African community needs better than anything Chinese banks could deliver. One comment from a financial executive struck the deepest. He admitted that diaspora professionals understood both the American market system and African community structures. They were designing products that worked for small farmers and market women, making Chinese financial services less necessary. It was not only about technology or loans, it was about relevance. When Traoré returned home, the pressure began almost immediately. Projects funded by Chinese banks suddenly faced unexplained delays. Loan approvals that had seemed routine were now under extended review. Joint ventures collapsed overnight when Chinese partners withdrew without warning. Trade agreements with countries hosting diaspora investment quietly became more restrictive and more expensive. The message was unmistakable. Choose Chinese dependency or choose African American partnership, but not both. Families across Burkina Faso began to feel the effects. A cooperative of farmers that had been expecting new irrigation equipment found that their supplier had backed out. The supplier admitted privately that Chinese partners had frozen their credit lines. In Ouagadougou, a small technology startup working with diaspora investors discovered that import permits for servers were suddenly harder to obtain. For ordinary citizens, the pattern was clear, even if no one spoke openly. Progress linked to diaspora involvement came with invisible obstacles. Yet the pushback had an unexpected effect. Instead of discouraging collaboration, it strengthened it. African American investors who had treated Africa as a side project began to realize they were part of a larger struggle. What seemed like isolated business deals now looked like a movement for independence. One renewable energy expert, Dr. Keisha Williams, explained it simply. At first, she thought she was building solar systems. Now she understood she was contributing to freedom from dependency. The situation placed the United States in a delicate position. Washington had pledged more than $65 billion to Africa since the 2022 Leaders Summit. The G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure had already mobilized over $60 billion toward its goal of $200 billion by 2027. These numbers suggested alternatives to Beijing's $200 billion in loans. At the same time, American forces had just withdrawn from Niger. The departure of troops created a vacuum in the Sahel that could be filled either by instability or by new forms of partnership. For American policymakers, the choice was stark. Support diaspora-led networks that emphasize skills and resilience, or watch Chinese dependency tighten again. For older Americans watching from afar, the contrast raised familiar concerns. In the Cold War era, foreign influence often determined whether regions drifted toward liberty or dependency. Today, as one generation worries about their grandchildren's future, the same pattern emerges in Africa. The question is whether the United States will recognize the value of diaspora expertise before it is too late. By the end of 2024, it was clear that an economic war had begun. It was not fought with soldiers or drones. It was fought with contracts, supply chains, and trade agreements. Every delayed loan, every canceled joint venture, every tightened clause carried the weight of strategy. For Beijing, it was a defense of influence. For Africans and their diaspora partners, it was a test of dignity. So the cliffhanger is unavoidable. If Beijing has already resorted to economic pressure after a single contract, what will they do when the diaspora network expands further into energy, health, and finance? What began as scattered efforts soon transformed into something larger than anyone expected. After the telecom victory and the tense meetings in Beijing, a new idea took shape. Instead of relying on isolated partnerships between individual African nations and individual diaspora professionals, why not connect all of them into a single system? The seed of that thought came during a health planning meeting in Ouagadougou. A visiting cardiovascular surgeon from the United States suggested that African American doctors and engineers working across the continent should be linked to one another and to the governments they serve. Out of that suggestion grew the African Diaspora Development Network. Within 3 months, the network reached across 23 African countries. Communication channels were established, resource-sharing platforms were created. Coordination systems were set up so that separate projects could support one another. A diaspora engineer in Ghana could share software designs with a solar energy team in Burkina Faso. A medical trainer in Lagos could connect with a university program in Dakar. What had once been individual sparks became a coordinated flame. The numbers behind the movement gave it credibility. Remittances to Nigeria alone reached more than $20 billion in 2024. Surpassing foreign direct investment and proving that diaspora capital was not only significant but consistent. These flows of money, once used mainly for groceries and school fees, were now being channeled into small businesses, health programs, and digital startups. Governments began to notice. Ghana's earlier Year of Return program, which had invited diaspora communities to reconnect, provided a political model. The new network, gave it economic muscle. Consider the story of a family from Atlanta who relocated part of the year to Accra. They opened a small carpentry shop that employed 12 local apprentices. What began as a modest project, funded by remittances, quickly became a workshop, producing furniture for schools. In the past, such a business might have remained invisible. Inside the network, however, it became an example of how diaspora engagement could create jobs and pride in local craftsmanship. For young Africans, the effect was powerful. Students who had once viewed emigration as the only path to success began to imagine careers built at home with global support. University graduates could attend workshops led by diaspora professionals and see role models who shared their history and values. A Ghanaian software student, for example, might hear a lecture from an African-American engineer who explained both the challenges of working in Silicon Valley and the satisfaction of contributing to projects in West Africa. Such encounters turned abstract possibilities into tangible goals. The network also shifted how diaspora members viewed their role. Many had treated African projects as charitable causes or short-term side ventures. Once connected, they began to see themselves as part of a movement. Each contract, each investment, and each training program became a piece of a larger puzzle. The sense of family, pride, and continuity that grew from this realization proved stronger than any financial incentive. Beijing did not anticipate this change. Chinese planners had assumed that competition would always come from Western governments or corporations. They had not prepared for Africans and African Americans working together across borders with both cultural familiarity and professional expertise. The network represented something China could not replicate. They could copy hardware, offer scholarships, or even hire diaspora consultants, but they could not generate the authentic family bond that came from shared identity. As the network matured, governments began to adjust. Ministers in several countries set aside dedicated offices to coordinate diaspora partnerships. Regional bodies began to discuss how to integrate diaspora expertise into continental strategies. What had started as an experiment began to look like the foundation of a new economic bloc. For families in villages and towns, the benefits became visible. Clinics gained new equipment through diaspora-linked medical programs. Farmers received mobile apps designed by diaspora coders to track weather patterns and market prices. Local banks introduced financial products tailored to small traders, borrowing ideas from diaspora professionals who had worked in American credit unions. These improvements were not abstract. They changed daily life. By late 2024, the African Diaspora Development Network had become a phrase repeated in both African parliaments and diaspora conferences in New York, Atlanta, and Chicago. It was no longer only about economics. It was about identity. For the first time in centuries, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic were beginning to see themselves as partners in a shared future. Yet this new power created questions that could not be ignored. How would established powers respond to a network that reduced their leverage? Could African unity with diaspora expertise withstand external pressure? Most importantly, could ordinary families keep faith in the idea that true independence is possible? The next chapter would provide the answers. If scattered sparks had already grown into a flame, what might happen when the network expands into every sector of African life? While African leaders and diaspora professionals were busy creating new links, policymakers in Washington were watching closely. The United States had already pledged more than $65 billion to Africa since the 2022 Leaders Summit. Through the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure, more than $60 billion had been mobilized with the aim of reaching $200 billion by 2027. The Digital Transformation with Africa initiative was also underway, seeking to mobilize $800 million for secure networks, digital skills, and modern institutions. On paper, these commitments looked impressive. The question was whether they could keep pace with the speed and authenticity of diaspora-led partnerships. For American strategists, the situation was complicated by security concerns. In mid-2024, U.S. forces left their last 2 drone bases in Niger, closing facilities that had once been central to counterterrorism operations across the Sahel. The silence of those airfields raised a new set of questions. Could secure infrastructure and strong economic networks offer the kind of stability that military presence once provided? If so, supporting diaspora-led development would no longer be only a matter of economics. It would become a matter of national security. For older Americans watching these developments, the story sounded familiar. Many remembered the Cold War years when foreign influence determined whether nations leaned toward liberty or toward dependency. Now, as they think about their grandchildren's safety, the same themes appear in Africa. If diaspora professionals can build networks that are both reliable and culturally connected, then Africa may provide more trustworthy partners than any foreign base ever offered. Yet there is hesitation in Washington. Officials know that competing with Beijing requires both capital and credibility. Money can be pledged, but credibility comes from trust. The diaspora, with its family ties and cultural bonds, already has what governments cannot buy. This is what unsettles Beijing and what should motivate Washington. If the United States truly wants stability in the Sahel and across Africa, it will need to recognize that diaspora innovation is not a rival, but an ally. The cliffhanger is clear. Will American policymakers embrace the diaspora's role as a bridge between Africa and the United States? Or will they leave the field open for Beijing to rebuild dependency? The story of Africa's emerging partnerships is not just about contracts or capital. It is about identity, dignity, and the legacy left for future generations. Families across Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Nigeria are beginning to see how diaspora expertise can change daily life. Clinics are equipped with new medical tools. Farmers use apps designed for their own markets, and young people gain digital skills that allow them to imagine futures at home instead of abroad. These changes are visible, and they carry a meaning that is larger than any loan agreement. China has invested more than $200 billion over 2 decades to secure influence in Africa. The United States has pledged more than $65 billion since 2022 and is seeking to expand through programs like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and the Digital Transformation with Africa initiative. These commitments matter, but they are only part of the story. The true test is whether Africans and their diaspora partners can sustain cooperation in the face of outside pressure. The warning signs are clear. When Beijing felt its dominance slipping, projects slowed, loans stalled, and joint ventures collapsed. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. Yet instead of weakening the movement, the pressure revealed its strength. Investors, professionals, and families began to understand they were part of something bigger. They were not only building businesses, they were building independence. The question now is simple. but profound. Is Ibrahim Traoré leading Africa into genuine self-reliance or into confrontation that could provoke new struggles? Will the diaspora network grow into a foundation for unity, or will external powers succeed in dividing it? These questions matter not only for Africa, but for the world. When Africa becomes less dependent, global power balances shift. When diaspora expertise replaces foreign dominance, new models of development emerge. If this story makes you pause, consider what piece of infrastructure you would want to see fully in African hands first. Would it be energy, networks, or medicine? Your answer reflects your values, and sharing it allows your voice to join a conversation about dignity and justice. As we close, let us remember that independence is not only about economics. It is about families who want stability, children who deserve opportunity, and nations that seek respect. May God bless Africa, a land of strength, resilience, and hope. And may every community that values freedom see in this story a reminder that even in times of uncertainty, people who act together can shape their destiny.